Thank you. So thank you, Professor Kurda, for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today. And to go back to one of the questions for the former speaker, let's start with a bit of continuity here. I think it's actually, well, at least chronologically speaking, it pretty much follows on the earlier discussion. Today I will not speak so much about silver, but rather about gold, or better about the Japanese decision to shift from silver to gold in 1897 and adopt a full-blown gold standard. Now, if you are acquainted with economic historical literature, then you know, I suppose, that this discussion has received quite some attention already, not only in Japanese, but remarkably, one would say, also in English. I think it has to do with let's say, the roller coaster development of Japanese modernization in the 19th century. We heard about the Bakufu currency crisis, but immediately after that, you have a whole series of institutions that are introduced, policies that are introduced in order to modernize Japan, and this seems to go very, very well. Monetarily speaking, it was certainly not easy. Bakufu crisis, Japan loses all its gold. It adopts a system of national banks after the American example, which was pretty much of a disaster indeed, because it opened the door to inflationary currency creation. Japan goes on the silver standard in the 1880s. It adopts a national bank modeled on the Belgian system in 1881. Which also issues currency in 1895, and finally in 1897 it goes on the gold standard. Now, there are a few interpretations of why Japan does that, and I want to review them briefly with you, and later, after reviewing, introduce my own interpretation. The first of all is, as you see, the gold standard and borrowing costs agreement. According to several economic historians, Japan may very well have adopted the gold standard in order to lower its risk premium when accessing foreign capital abroad. It's a very well-known argument. The other one is the gold standard in trade. Quite a few authors tend to disagree with the gold standard and borrowing cost agreement and say that, well, maybe Japan adopted the gold standard in order to tap into the growing share of world trade among gold standard countries, mainly Great Britain and some countries on the European continent. Now, I believe there is a third argument that it may be there's also a combination of the earlier two, but nevertheless is radically different. And you see the question mark there. Don't worry about that. I do believe that this thing is possible. But let's go through the gold standard and borrowing cost agreement argument first. This is an old story based on the gold standard as a good housekeeping seal of approval, a paper by Bordeaux and Rokov, which has later been used by two Israeli economic historians, Sussman and Yaffe. And there is, interestingly, a great deal of contemporary evidence of this as well, one would say. And I quote Matsukata Masayoshi, who says, I hope you can read this, since now that the capitalists of the gold standard countries have become assured that they will be no longer in constant danger of suffering unexpected losses from investments made in this country, in other words, they will not suffer losses because of exchange risk, we may very well see a growing willingness of foreigners to invest and to borrow, to lend money to this country. But there are a few problems of interpretation there, and I have this I discussed this with friend and colleague Marc Flandreau. He himself also thinks that actually the whole period of gold standard adoption for Japan, 1897, is basically statistically overdetermined, which means that there's so many happenings going on there. In 1897, Japan does not, or let's say in that period, Japan does not only adopt the gold standard there. There is the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. There is another war coming in 1904. The Boxer Rebellion, 1900. So it is basically a very volatile geopolitical environment in Asia, and it may very well be impossible to link gold standard adoption to only one other variable being borrowing costs. Maybe this is very difficult to determine. It's a methodological critique, and I tend to agree with that. Then the other one, the tougher one, I tend to believe, because the gold standard and borrowing cost argument has largely been refuted, but we'll see that later. This is also a macroeconomic argument. Lopez, Cordova, and Meisner as well have argued in this direction. And for trade and for the gold standard in Asia, I believe it's mainly Chris Michner and Joachim Volt who have done some work in this. They think the gold standard, well, I think they're right when saying that. The gold standard increased bilateral trade flows by reducing transaction costs or exchange rate volatility. I think they're right when saying that. However, it does not necessarily mean that countries, that was the reason for countries to go on the gold standard. In macroeconomic terms, one would speak of endogeneity here. Once a critical mass of countries have moved onto the gold standard, it only makes sense to go under the gold standard oneself. And here also, there is a great deal of contemporary evidence. Matsushita made his remark about foreign borrowing in 1897. This is Sakatani, Matsushita's aide, who in the I think 1894 it is, says like, many of the once famous silver standard countries, and he's referring to India here, I've already moved to gold. So it's only natural for us to do the very same. However, again, I believe there are problems of interpretation. Because if one only looks at the gold standard and trade argument, one tends to ignore the fact that there are no institutions that sell trade insurance. And those things did exist. HSBC was in Asia to do exactly that. And in 1889, the Yokohama Specie Bank, also an exchange bank, was given a special rediscounting facilities with the Bank of Japan in order to do that. So it's not that there were no institutions so that gold standard, silver standard country trade would be hampered. There's not necessarily an argument. What I believe is missing from a great deal of the interpretations is the role of empire. A lot of economic historians tend to talk about Japan as if it was what I call a small open economy. Well, historically speaking, it's what's not exactly that. If you look at the Asian context, empire is just too strong of a variable to ignore. Monetarily speaking, let's do that, otherwise I'm going to do it too long. This actually starts, again, with the Mexican dollar, or in the 1870s, the fact that the Mexican dollar see some competitors coming out. And it directly has to do with happenings on the European continent in the 1870s. When Germany wins the Franco-Prussian War and used the French indemnity to go on the gold standard, it has a problem of excess silver reserves. Of course, it has simply a problem of exchanging them for enough gold, but also there is the exchange problem. Because by simply saying it will go on the gold standard, the price of silver falls. And it will be also difficult for Germany to get that silver on the market on advantageous terms. So what the Germans try at the time, and you can find this also well in newspapers, people as Zudbeer at the time say that we have to find a way of still having some use of silver. And there you see many attempts by many countries to use silver in the East. The Germans try it first. The French tried with the Canton dollar. The British do it with the Hong Kong dollar. The Americans try to do it, and the Japanese try to do it. They will introduce their own silver yen, but later also boekigin, or like it's called a dollar for a trade dollar for international trade, which is also slightly. It's more finer in terms of silver content, so they try to compete with the Mexican dollar. Japan has definitely understood the imperialist dynamics behind monetary things, because I think it's like 1875, they speak of introducing our silver dollar so it can replace the Mexican dollar as the main medium of exchange in the East. At the same time, it will become more assertive in monetary matters, for instance, also in the 1870s, by expelling monetary advisors that were put by different countries in Japan. They will expel the British from the Imperial Mint in Osaka. They will try to. They will enforce many laws that put foreign merchants at a disadvantage. And very importantly, I believe, with the change from Okuma Shigenobu to Matsukata Masayoshi, there is even a borrowing argument. Japan will stop borrowing from that period until 1890-70. This is very important for the discussion, I believe, when talking about the gold standard, and something that is not yet addressed by either Sussman and Jaffe or Michener and Wolff. Matsukata is definitely an imperialist, we know, under the slogan "Rich Nation, Strong Army." I believe he has, let's say, three pillars on which the national economy rests. A silver standard, which, thanks to falling silver prices after 1870, gives the country a big export advantage, promoting exports extra by funding the Yokohama Specie Bank, and fiscal retrenchment, something what we nowadays would call, well, I guess rather unfortunate, internal devaluation. what is going on in Greece as well. So it's like a draconian monetary reform program to make Japan's silver yen convertible. The policy, or his policies, are very successful. It will buy him, in a period of 20 years, Japan will only run trade surpluses. And this will, as many people have noted, result in the money that can be used to buy warships, which are then used to defeat the Chinese at Port Arthur. That's 1895. So what does this mean for the former arguments? I think we do not have necessarily to go into the Sussman and Jaffe argument about gold standard and foreign borrowing. Because if you look at Michener's paper, which is a debunking of the fact that Japanese risk premium, the risk premium fell after 1895, you see that indeed the risk premium does not fall for Japanese bonds. Sussman and Jaffe have only looked at one bond, but if you look at other bonds, you see that the risk premium even increases. So the gold standard and borrowing argument is not right, at least in the Japanese case. But would this mean that it's all right to say that there is a direct relationship between the gold standard and trade? This too, I think, is very improbable for many reasons. First of all, there is a reason of procedure. Michener and Wolff and Shizume of the Bank of Japan, they treat all those discussions in the 90s as if there were one long debate. That's not true. At least in 1891, Matsukata very strongly influences the debate, so people are in favor of the gold standard. But in 1897, the situation is even different, because what did not matter in 1891, namely national expenditure, Japan hardly had any national expenditure, that is turned around radically after the Sino-Japanese War because of a fiscal program, a fiscal expansion program called the Sengo Zaisei, the post-bellum financial administration, and it's actually a large military build-up plan, which you see, in the tables down there. You see certain jumps, not only in yen terms, but also in terms of its percentage in the national expenditure. And this suddenly, especially around 1897, becomes so high, it's around 50% of the national budget. The fact that Shizume, Michener, and Weidenmeyer have neglected that, I think, is a very strong argument against the gold standard and trade argument. And even the idea that Japan used the indemnity from the Sino-Japanese War to go on the gold standard needs some nuance. Because if one decomposes the use of the indemnity, which you can do through financial reports from the time, you see that 53% of the whole Chinese indemnity is directly used. It's the yellow and the orange part, is directly used for military expansion, and not for acquiring bullion. So you could actually say that the larger part of the indemnity is used for military buildup. Now, how does the debate about the indemnity become an argument in favor of the gold standard? This too is strange. Second, why was it kept in an account in London? This would be a strange policy from the viewpoint of an imperialist. And third, was keeping it in London not a threat to Japanese national security? Thank you. again, we can go through contemporary newspapers from the time, and then you see that many people were criticizing Matsukata for that. On the one hand, you had the militarists or the nationalist people who, through the Toyo Keizai Shimpo, I think, argued that the indemnity should be converted into gold and held as a war chest, Senso Junbikin, in Japan. On the other hand, you have the liberalists, mostly Taguchi Okichi, who said, no, holding the indemnity in Britain is economically wasteful. We should bring it home and use it completely, not for military buildup, but for, for boosting the country's economic reconversion. What then is at hand? Why does Matsukata's policy, or why does Matsukata's attitude seem to change around 1897? I argue that has to do with the notion of original sin. What many people have not looked at when looking at Japanese bonds at the time and Japanese trade at the time is that all those bonds were not denominated in Japanese yen. Japan could not borrow in Japanese yen. They were denominated in British pound. And in order to do this on favorable terms, I argue, Japan went on a peg with the gold standard so it could borrow and basically insure against the exchange rate risk that it would have had if it would have made on silver. Indeed, it could not predict the further fall or rise in the silver price, but at the time, if you look at a time series, the price of silver was internationally considered to be falling only even further. So it pegged its currency to a currency and consequently had limited policy maneuverability, which means that when there would be it would be difficult domestically to alleviate pressure in the domestic economy because of the fact that you are bound by upholding the exchange rate with the British pound. And that's indeed what happened. 1897, Matsukata's policy of going on the gold standard looks like, well, a disaster. In this cartoon from the Marumaru Chimbun, you see Matsukata sitting there. He has written, the gold standard is a failure. Kinsei Shipai, written on his knee, not on his knee, on his how do you call that thing? Shin bone. Yeah, that's it, chin bone. And he has this menu ue no kobu, which says jishoku kankoku, is an admonition to step down, because basically it was pretty much of a failure, or at least in the immediate post 1897 period. What was the problem then? In the aftermath, I'll make this very short, is the fact that the gold standard, there was definitely a relationship between the gold standard and borrowing, but it was actually the other way around. Because what happens when you keep foreign exchange reserves abroad in an account in London, you can use these directly for settling your balance of trade imbalances without experiencing an outflow of gold. So it sterilizes the classroom version of the classic gold standard, by means of which prices would fall, so your economy would become competitive again. This did not happen. Rather, the Japanese gold standard is pretty much of an inflationary gold standard, which was even made worse because those foreign exchanges were not only kept at the London account, but they were sometimes sold to the Bank of Japan, which added it to its note issue reserve. Those notes would flow into the market, further blow up prices, and discourage exports. And this is a situation that you have at the period. What happens then, and I think Suzuki Toshio was the first one to see this, was that basically Japan keeps on borrowing. It basically did not borrow. It did not go into the gold standard to borrow, but it keeps on borrowing in order to maintain the gold standard. That is the problem in the aftermath of the Sino-Japanese War. The trade situation of Japan shifts 180% from running constant trade surpluses. It goes into a deficit for the whole period, I think, until 1910 or something like that. That's today's argument. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, thank you. So, yeah. Well, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation.
Thank
If I may go on with the aftermath part of your presentation, you told us very briefly that the gold standard conventional mechanism of adjustments
Well,
of imbalances
yes.
didn't work as we predicted in
Well,
case.
I guess it never really worked, but I mean, it
Well,
certainly did not work in the Japanese case.
yeah, well, you mean even in the classroom?
Even in the classroom, it did,
Yeah,
yeah.
it didn't work in that case. But would have it work a little bit better in case the reserves have been kept inside the country? So money supply was related to the changes in reserves. You know what I mean?
Yes, but you're talking about foreign reserves keeping in your own country
Yes.
still, right?
Thus, in that case, money supply is much more related to the reserves, to the variation of reserves inside
Yes,
the country.
maybe. Yes, maybe. But my point is, and that's a paper I'm working on now, and I think somebody in the room is called Stefano Ugolini, and I'd like to, that's you, and I'd like to talk with you about that because you worked on the National Bank of Belgium in this respect, right? I tend to believe that original sin creates a double problem. It creates a tension between your international and domestic obligations. Internationally, because you have to maintain the exchange rate, and domestically, because artificially maintaining the exchange rate, especially in times of crisis, means that you may have a problem of providing enough liquidity to your domestic economy. So I mean, it means like if you artificially keep the exchange rate at a certain level, you run the risk of entering a situation of credit dry up. And so there is like a potential friction there. And I think that's exactly why the Japanese did what looks crazy at the first hand, namely, why would they, for God's sake, add forex reserves? Like it's basically a bookkeeping thing. Why would they also add those forex? Why would they sometimes sell it to the Bank of Japan, who then adds it to the currency reserve? I think they do that because the Bank of Japan, in terms of crisis, needs to be able to, to pump the extra credit into the economy. So I think Japan made the right choice. It's not the optimal choice, but it's a suboptimal one, And I think that is what's going on with a lot of countries who used similar mechanisms at the time. Austro-Hungary had the same problem. I think was it Denmark? Or the Swedish and Norwegian gold standards too. They have this thing that they experience this friction between domestic and international.
Sorry, my last comment on this, because I don't want to take everybody's time. So you are suggesting that the Bank of Japan was conducting a modern monetary policy in terms of our days.
Yes, but I think that it was certainly not the only one to do that. No, there were many banks at the time did that, and you can find literature. If you want, I will give you some titles about that as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for a nice presentation. I just wanted to ask you, as you are really a specialist in Japanese gold standard, so the adoption of gold standard really related to the Sino-Japanese war, right? And it's also true that first Japanese asked the indemnity in silver, right?
Well, no, it was not specified. It was said
In thaler.
pay in tile, but
In
tile
thaler.
it doesn't conform to silver pieces. A tile is an imaginary unit.
So,
and then later.
So you think that from the beginning they ask the indemnity in gold?
No, I think nobody really thought about it at first. I think Matsukata came up with it later.
Yeah. Okay, and so my question is, do you think that Japanese actually decided to switch to gold standard under the the triple invention put any kind of influence on this decision? I mean, after the Shimonoseki Treaty was signed, Russia, France, and Germany made so-called triple invasion. They asked Japan to return the Ladun Peninsula and so on. So Japanese realized that the next war actually is very foreseen.
Well, I think indirectly, yes, because it goes on the gold standard, which then allows it later to go into the British, to the Anglo-Japanese alliance, which gives it, let's say, an okay for going to war with Russia. I think indirectly it may have, but I've never found any evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Um, I really like your effort to revisit the reasons for Japan's adherence to the gold standard, and I really think that original sin is very important in this story. Still, I mean, the way you overcome original sin is that you develop a financial system and financial lender domestically. Because the way, in the end, the rationale you propose, I really don't see very much the difference between your argument and, I mean, the Bordeaux and Rokoff argument. Because I mean,
Well,
there's no difference
no,
in,
you're right. Yeah. Well, actually, that's what Sussman and Yaffe also told me. They said like, well, basically, it's also part of our argument. I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't think so, because
What's the difference? I mean, between, I mean, there's no difference if you keep your gold in London or in your vaults in at the Bank of Japan. Because
well,
basically, I
no,
mean, that's
but
the same.
that's
Because you are foreign, you are borrowing in foreign money in both ways. Because you're borrowing in gold in other cases.
what this
So-
argument adds, though, I think, is that it adds by saying that that original sin made it impossible for Japan to adopt an optimal policy. It had to choose a suboptimal one, which has its institutional repercussions, namely the fact that it could not channel cheap credit easily to the domestic economy when it was needed, and then develops the dynamics in terms of not gold standard adoption, but in terms of gold standard maintenance. The gold standard, adopting the gold standard is easy, but maintaining it, that's the hard part in the Japanese case, I think.
Yeah.
But indeed, it's true. There's certainly, hopefully there's something true about the Sussman and Yaffe argument. They definitely, although, I don't even know whether borrowing was their desire from the outset. For this, we have to distinguish between borrowing on the domestic market and the international market. At the time of the Sino-Japanese War, borrowing domestically was still possible. There even was a surplus of domestic borrowing. But in the aftermath of the war, there is a certain dry up. And then there is, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Then Japan has to go on capital markets, and they have to do it in a way that is still, not totally disadvantageous to them. And I think that's where the gold standard argument kicks in again.
Yeah, I mean, I still don't see very much the difference with the with their argument. But what I wanted to suggest in order to go deeper into the argument is that maybe trying to go more specifically into the timing, not only from a Japanese perspective, but from an international perspective, because this is very much the moment where a lot of countries go to gold. I mean, a lot of extra-European countries like India and a lot of European peripheral countries like Italy and Spain.
Yes.
So they either they go on gold or they shadow the gold
That's
standard.
true. But in
And
the
I
Indian
really
case-
think the reason why this takes place in the 1890s is that choosing gold in this very moment is not anymore a deflationary choice, because you have gold mines discovered
Very
in
true,
South Africa
very
and so.
true, yes.
And for Japan, for that moment, it's very important not to have a deflationary, because they look very much at developing export. So I think that you would find a lot of more arguments for your paper if you.
It's
look
definitely
in-
true. But there again, just one more. If it have some more time, just okay. One important thing there, and this is something where I radically, if not, it sometimes irritates me when people say that India goes on gold. I don't quite agree with that interpretation, because again, you take out the Great Britain-India connect there.
They shadow gold. Like
Yeah, but I
Austria,
mean,
like
but I mean,
Italy, like a lot of
I
countries.
think there was a very strong pressure from Great Britain as well at the time to do that. So this is not a country's decision to go on gold, but it's mostly forced on them, probably because
There's a lot of debate,
I
because
know,
you
I know.
have
In the Indian case it's harder. It's not easy, but
because you have a lot of pressure from people that are receive their wages and their retirement from India.
Sure,
They are
sure,
British, so they
sure.
have a lot of exchange risk,
Yes,
and so you have a lot of lobbying on this.
that's true.
So it's very complicated.
Yes, exactly. And
But
also,
they shadow gold, so
Yes.
it's not so different. In
No,
India.
that's
like
true.
Austria, like Italy, like Spain, like a lot of
yes,
countries.
yes, and it's true what you say. But then what I would ask you, but I also don't have the answer. What, according to you, is what causes this flip this shift suddenly from the long deflation to a more inflating international gold standard? It's not only gold discoveries. That's impossible because there are too many countries going on gold at a time. I think it has to do as well with the naval race. Again, an imperial thing.
I mean, I don't have a definite answer on this, but if, for example, if you look at the balance sheet of the Bank of England in the 1890s, you see that in the mid-1890s, you have an accumulation of gold reserve, which is absolutely unprecedented. So at one moment, people try to, I mean, maybe this is just a question of expectation, because in all this, I mean, that's the main story with the demise of silver in the 1870s. It's a lot of story with expectation. And I think that at that moment, a lot of people perceive, at least they perceive gold as not being deflationary anymore, as it did be the case for 2 decades.
Yeah.
So thank you. Perhaps this story is quite the close relation to the fact Kato presented in the morning, and perhaps I also commented the presence of Chinese market cross-related to this subject, because they keep their silver standard also, but the India also going to the move to gold standard. That means that the big chance for Japanese to move to the gold standard, because the rival to the Chinese market move too. So there are many aspects working. So, but anyway,
Thank you.
Continue to discuss. So thank you very much.
Okay.
So the third presenter. Oh.